Hello, this is Al Ristorfer, and I've been asked by the College of Bishops to provide a little overview about a project we have called CACINA 2025. This presentation is in three parts. This first part is a basic introduction to the plan and to the strategy and to the whole idea. Part two is a look at where we are now in 2019, and part three are the elements of a strategic plan to take us to some place significantly different in 5 years. The project was launched at the General Assembly in May of 2019 when, as a result of a small group exercise that asked various teams to come up with an understanding of the values of CACINA, what should our mission statement be, and what have you, my small group was thinking more about what have we done since we've been here. We felt that one of the things that we need to talk about as a community, as a church, is that where are we going and how are we going to get there? And the rationale for that is that we talked an awful lot about the fact that in huge numbers the people of God are fleeing the Roman Catholic Church and other churches, seeking someplace new, someplace forgiving and accepting and affirming, yet would be deeply Catholic in its theology, its liturgy, and its prayer life. The statistical box you see in the bottom there kind of proves that point. What the Pew Research Center has found out in a very recent study is that in the years from the 12 years from 2017 to 2019, the Catholic population in the United States has dropped by 4%. That amounts to 10 million Catholics. So even if you take out children and you take out you allow for people that have gone on to the next life, we're still talking about a large number, 3, 4, 5 million, who knows what it actually is, of adult Catholics who are out there wandering in the wilderness because they don't feel comfortable in the Roman Catholic Church. In another Pew Research Center study, there may be an explanation as to the kind of things that are impacting this flight of population. Of that survey, of those considered practicing Catholics, a whopping 27% have scaled back mass attendance, donations, and other participations in the church based on their scandalization stemming from the sex abuse scandal. Only 36% of people think that the U.S. bishops have handled this well, and that's the kind of thing, one of many, that's probably driving people out of the Roman Church. And yet here we sit as CACINA as the possible answer for what we're looking for. So our little group felt compelled that we need to reach out to these people, welcome them into our church, to take Christ literally when he says, preach the gospel and make disciples of all nations, and therefore lead these people back to God. So what this project is all about, and what this presentation is all about, is a strategic plan to move CACINA from where we are today to someplace more substantive and robust in 5 years. So this is an outline, really, of very high-level ideas within this strategic framework, and what we're hoping will do is it'll foster deeper thinking into how feasible is this, how really to think this through more completely, creating more detailed plans, enlisting volunteers and other people who'd be willing to help get us there, and then to finally get us started. So as we contemplate how to grow the church, we referred back to 3 different models that we think are instructive about how we might go forward. First is the early church. And when you think about how did the early Christian movement go from nearly total eradication after the death of its leader, Jesus, as well as the next tier of leaders, the apostles, to becoming a major movement across the Roman Empire that eventually dominated life everywhere there and eventually the world. I mean, the Emperor Nero, according to the Annals of Tacitus, clearly describes the Christian community as a hated population in Rome that was significant and was a threat to the city, and blamed them for the burning of the city in roughly 60-something AD. So how did they get there? How did they become something from almost being extinct to becoming a threat to the Roman Empire? The formula that the early church used is something we should take a look at. Another area is commercial strategic planning. How do small little enterprises with nothing more than an idea and a little bit of capital rise to become dominant players in their industry and sustain that dominance over time? The methodology around commercial strategic planning is well known. There's lots out there about it. You can get a master's degree in this. We should learn from that set of initiatives as well. And then finally, there are other growing churches. It's a myth that all churches are losing population. Many, many, many are. There are some others that are holding their own, and there are other churches that are not only not in decline, but are actually growing. And we should take a look at what they do and see if they can't guide us to go for our own growth. So a little bit more about the early church. I think if you break down what the early church does, if I use my organization development expert hat and I look at how this movement brought about societal change, I think it's because it had these 9 components. A very defined set of values and beliefs, a compelling mission, namely to convert everybody, a highly differentiated message. No one was talking in the terms that the early Christians were, a brand that I'll come back to in a minute. They had a very clear process by which they developed leaders. All you have to do is look at how St. Paul was trained from being a Pharisee out to persecute Christians to becoming an apostle, what he had to go through and learn under Barnabas in order before he was ordained by the imposition of hands. So there was a process there that they understood. There was a clear governance model. Everybody understood who was in charge, who was the ultimate arbiter of disagreements, namely Peter in overall and in Jerusalem, particularly James. They had clear programs to recruit members. They went out and solicited new members, and then they had ways of indoctrinating them when they came into the church. Once in the church, there were common practices and rituals, namely the sacrifice of the Eucharist and other rituals, baptism. They also had their act together. They knew how to defend themselves logically and use that logic to teach others about the faith or to defend themselves if the faith was attacked. I want to go back to the brand, though, because I think that's really innovative. When you think about this symbol of the fish, that was the predominant brand, the predominant symbol Christians used to identify themselves to one another. It was not the cross. The cross was a symbol of derision that would have turned people away. But the fish was interesting. For Christians, it reminded them of Jesus' command to become fishers of men. But it also was very, very clever. If you take a look at the map of the Roman Empire, it totally engulfs the Mediterranean Sea. So much so that the Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostre, which means our ocean, our sea. This whole place, all this water belongs to us and everything in it. That means it was not only a seafaring population, but all the populations around the Mediterranean were fish eaters. Fishmongers that sold fish were ubiquitous, and that symbol was outside the shops of fishmongers everywhere. The Christians took that and said, we're fishers of men. This is going to be our symbol. But the other thing they did with it is they used the word for fish in Greek, which is ichthus, iota, chi, theta, upsilon, sigma, and used that as a memory jogger to totally summarize the truths of the faith. The iota chi stands for Jesus Christus, the theta upsilon stands for Theou Huios, and the S stands for Soter. Put all that together and it says, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the Savior. And they called that little core message, that little very succinct message, the kerygma, which in Greek means the seed or the kernel. So much so that when that is planted inside you, it totally changes your life. You can't go to the temples and worship the idols any longer. So this whole thing, I think, was not by accident. I think this was a thought-through strategy that but people that understood how to make mission happen put all these components together. Either that or they just happened to be very lucky and very clever. But I think it was a deliberate strategy that we can learn from. We could do the same things and should. Commercial world is almost the same idea, with one little difference here. They're very compelling. They're very compelling offerings that they want to offer, and they have a mission about that. But what they do here is they really focus on specific markets. They don't try to sell everything to everybody. They try to sell very specific stuff to very specific people for very specific reasons. They look at what people need and they try to fulfill that need through their offerings. To that extent, they have a very differentiated value proposition that is market segment dependent. They focus all their branding, all their messaging around that. They then develop goals about how to penetrate those markets. They then develop what they have to do to make those products and make those offerings appreciated. They really develop core competencies and core practices. They then measure it. They put metrics around it so they know how well they're doing, which feeds into their governance structures and creates performance reviews and feedback that will go back in and adjust the plans so that they continue to their market penetration. That's the kind of thing that commercial organizations use. And once again, we ought to think this thing too. Who are our target markets? What are our differentiated messagings that we need to put address each one of those markets? What do we want to offer each one of those markets? And then how do we measure how well we're doing? Are things we could learn from the commercial world. And then lastly, there are many churches out there that are growing and growing significantly. The Spirit of St. Stephen in Minneapolis, that Father Harrigan talks about. Right here in Timonium, Maryland, there's Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is a Catholic church. And of course, there are many, many evangelical churches. And when you look at these churches that are growing, you see the same kinds of things. Very defined value statements, very defined belief systems, compelling mission, very targeted markets. They know who they're going after, and they differentiate their messages accordingly. Then they really focus on consistent and constant and professional and serious communications using all kinds of media that are available to them. They execute their internal plan thoughtfully and with excellence. And they do as a result, they develop very core practices that they do extraordinarily well. They have leadership models that are participative, but not necessarily totally collaborative. And they focus on building community. All these churches do the same thing. Once again, we're in that same boat. Who are our target markets? What do we want to say to them? And what is it that we're going to offer them when they show up that we've done extraordinarily well? And how do we make sure that all of our experiences that people have with CACINA are consistently well? That's the challenge that we can learn from them. A little more in detail about Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Timonium. Father Michael White and Tom Corcoran have written a series of books called Rebuilt that describes their journey from being a failing Catholic parish like many are, where they were down to literally hundreds of families left on their registry, to now being back to multiple thousands of families in their church, growing by leaps and bounds. How did they do that? Well, it's all laid out in their books, and as well as on a website they've got called rebuiltparish.com. I would strongly advise everyone that's listening to this presentation to check out that website, see what they're talking about, see the pictures and the testimonials and all that. Look at the certification programs and the resources that are there, because they could teach us an awful lot about how to grow a church, how to become a vibrant church, and how to become a church that is fulfilling Christ's mission to make disciples of all nations. What they talk about are things like this. They have a very, very committed and cohesive leadership team that they develop, and they make sure they've gone through several iterations of it until they finally get it right. They are very focused on reaching those who are not in the church, which is they call the unchurched and the disaffected church, the same population we should be going after. For those in the church, they talk a lot about how to develop the sense of discipleship, where people own the message and own the mission and make it part of the way they live their lives as Christians. They then, as I said earlier, constantly and consistently communicate through social media and other strategies out there. They take advantage of inexpensive resources provided by various web-based applications to get the people, and it works. They know exactly what they want to say to whom, and they use these devices to get there, and they do it constantly. And then lastly, they become a place where specific issues can be dealt with through very small group meetings they have around that issue. So that's how they build community. They talk a lot about their three anchors, their strategic anchors. They want to grow wider by not only focusing heavily on recruiting people from that are not part of their church, but also when they show up, they have really thought through how to make them feel welcome. They also then, for those that are in the church, as I said earlier, they really have developed a clear path to discipleship so that people walk away changed and as a result more willing to come back. And the other thing they do is the prayerful experience of the Mass They work their butts off trying to make this thing, those experiences exceptional, solemn, something very different than what somebody experiences on a day-to-day basis. They don't see it as entertainment, they see it as prayer and as worship, and they really work at making it perfect. We could learn a lot from the Tivity BVN as well as from the Spirit of St. Stephen's and these other churches. So, what our agenda is all about here is to it'll look like this. Number one is the next part two, is to take a look at CACINA 2019. Where are we now? Where did we come from? How big are we? How are we governed? What kind of relationships do we have? What do we believe in? And so forth and so on. And we're going to end that with something called a SWOT analysis, which is the framework for what we need to consider to go forward. And then part three is CACINA 2025. Where can we be in 5 years and how to get there? That's what we're going to talk about: our vision and mission, our opportunity, what we want to offer that to those markets in that opportunity, how to set goals, what those goals look like, and then break this whole thing down into work streams that are areas of work needed to be focused on and needed to be improved upon if the plan's going to work. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with a little bit about the master plan to get it started. So stay tuned. Come back for part two.